Hey, everybody. So last presentation of the day. Let's do it. All right, cool. Awesome. So what unites us as people? Are there common threads that bring us together as humans all across the world and throughout time? For anywhere you go, pretty much, one of the standout elements in culture that we talk about is art. People sing, they dance, they paint, they draw, but they also fight. We'll go ahead, next one, boom. Yeah, cool, we also fight. Despite the rather bloody history of human conflict, the way that we approach combat can be considered an art, and it's definitely something that varies from culture to culture. Today, we can look at ancient and modern methods of fighting, the martial arts, through the lens of culture and start to discover something really interesting. When you gain an understanding of how a culture approaches something, especially something as fundamental as self-defense, you can gain an appreciation of something very different than yourself. I want to start out by saying that while I've had the incredible honor of learning about some elements of culture from my travels and my studies and my training, I'm not an expert on any one country's culture, so I will endeavor to do my best with the terms and the context and the history that I'm not intimately familiar with, having grown up here in the United States. But let's go ahead and jump in and start a discussion of a cultural movement that we find very commonly in the martial arts. There's a martial arts position that's trained a lot of techniques and a lot of different arts that all of you are actually using right now, and that's sitting down. Yeah. Martial arts is often a study of self-defense, and if you're going to be defending yourself, it's worthwhile to learn how to do so from the positions you commonly find yourself in. So a lot of martial arts train techniques from a seated position. But before we even look at the different ways that the martial arts block or punch or kick or move, we can start to see cultural differences in the very way that they sit down. So this position, Seiza, is used in a lot of formal Japanese martial arts, traditional Japanese martial arts. You saw the Kendo Club use this in part of their demonstration earlier. This was a formal way of sitting in the time period that a lot of traditional Japanese martial arts were codified and put together. And so from this position, they learned to show respect, they learned to draw weapons, they learned to move, to defend, and deploy different techniques from this seated position. As another example, in the Majapahit martial arts, which is a blended style of a variety of martial arts from Southeast Asia, this position, called Sawa, is commonly taught as a seated position from that part of the world. So while this position looks and functions biomechanically rather differently than Seiza that we saw before, they still learn to avoid, move, shift, and fire different attacks and defenses from that position. So both of those positions, again, function differently, and they can be a little bit awkward for some Westerners to adopt, primarily because they aren't commonly found in our culture. So we're not used to the requirements of flexibility or coordination that they demand. But there are examples that we find today in America that work on similar concepts. So today we can look at tactical and self-defense firearms training as an example of a modern martial art. And you can find a variety of classes, courses, seminars, and workshops on using your firearm from in or around your car or motor vehicle. So dealing with a steering column and a seat belt, understanding angulation on windows, and how and when you can move or deploy a weapon from concealment or otherwise can be considered techniques from a modern cultural standpoint in our martial art. Here in America, we have common access to firearms and motor vehicles, and the modern techniques of martial arts reflect that. So how a martial art looks and appears to an observer, their movement style and aesthetic, can also have a lot of interesting cultural implications. For example, in the Afro-Brazilian martial art of capoeira, two participants stand in the center of a circle of people, and the circle claps and they sing and they play instruments, while the two in the center engage in a physical dialogue that often resembles a dance, albeit a rather vigorous and potentially aggressive one. And one of the fundamental movements in that dance is called the ginga. And it looks something like this, depending on your style or teacher. And from this position, they still learn to fire attacks and work on defensive movements and evasions. And that can seem like a relatively bizarre way to train combat, but Capoeira was developed in secret by people while in the bonds of slavery, and obscuring the direct physical practice of their fighting techniques was an absolute cultural necessity for them to continue to practice and develop this art in secret while enslaved. Without understanding that context, it can be nearly impossible to fully appreciate the art and the practice of capoeira. As another example, the martial art of Silat Sufi and Belladiri has some very interesting cultural implications. As opposed to some other styles of Silat, and like I mentioned and we saw earlier with the Sawa position from Majapahit Silat, Silat Sufi and Belladiri is incredibly upright, and they work on short footwork patterns called pelampas, where they're moving very short with their feet. And this has to do with where the style came from. In Brunei Dar Salam, they're known for the water villages. And traditionally, the merchant class lived on these villages on stilts that were in the river. They built houses and shops. And there are small bridges connecting these buildings. So the art developed its upright posture partially as a way of asserting class dominance, as the merchant class felt they were literally above the farming class. And the short footwork came out of necessity of fighting on bridges that are only about 4 feet wide. As you can see here with myself and fellow Symposium presenter Brian Pike, if you use large movements, you run the very real risk of falling in the river, which you don't want to do while you're fighting. We can also see different movement styles come about with, again, tactical firearms training. Differences in weapon selection, in team size, in time to train, yield different techniques when you're accomplishing the same purpose, for example, between local law enforcement or elite-level military operators. A two-person team with handguns might rely on different techniques than a four-person squad with rifles when accomplishing the same goal, say clearing and securing a room. One method isn't necessarily wrong or right, but they're products of their context. And you can see, like, very real times happening today, differences in these styles appearing, even when we're talking about modern tactical firearms. So I've had the great privilege to travel a lot to train and teach martial arts. I've been able to work with artists and fighters all over North America, in China, in Brunei, and in Okinawa. And those experiences have done a lot to enrich my training and my understanding of these martial arts. But one of the great things about martial arts is if you don't have access to that travel, though I highly recommend it, you can start to gain an understanding of culture anywhere that you practice your martial art. The physical techniques of martial arts are inexorably tied to the culture and the time period that they came from. So when you practice those techniques, you are able to tap into that culture. Increasing your cultural understanding is, I think, a worthwhile thing to do, but it's slightly academic. As an instructor, one of the things that I'm really looking for is a hopeful side effect of this increased cultural awareness. Martial arts are often talked about for their benefits in teaching respect. And while each martial art has their own code for respect and ways of demonstrating respect within their discipline, I really hope that my students gain a respect for each other, not just as martial artists, but as people. And one of the great things about martial arts is this idea that you can develop a sense of open-mindedness. And if you can be more open-minded to understanding different martial arts techniques from all over the world, maybe you can be more open to understanding your neighbor, to gain a respect and an empathy for the people in your life, but also the cultures and the people and the things that you don't understand. Martial arts has served as a great vehicle to do that in my life, and it's, I think, a fun and exciting activity for anyone to participate in. I think most of you here probably already do martial arts, but if you don't, I hope that you find one that you really enjoy. And if you do train martial arts, I really hope that you take the opportunity to look a little bit deeper into the culture that that art represents. You might find answers to questions you didn't even know you had. Thank you very much.